Cairo, Egypt, 1249. A kingdom is under attack. Crusaders have already taken Damietta. The Sultan is dying. Panic is everywhere. And in the middle of that chaos, the person who may have saved the state was not a king, not a prince, and not a general, but a woman who had once entered this world as a slave. Her name was Shajar al Durr, and her story is one of those real stories that feels too dramatic to be history, because it has everything: war, ambition, secrecy, betrayal, murder, and a woman rising so high that the world around her could not decide whether to fear her, use her, or destroy her. She began as an enslaved woman, rose into the royal court, became the wife of one of the most powerful rulers in Egypt, hid his death while enemy forces were advancing, helped hold the country together in the middle of invasion, and then did something almost unthinkable for her time. She took the throne for herself. And that is the part that makes this story so dangerous, because history can sometimes tolerate a powerful woman behind the curtain, but a woman ruling openly with power in her own name was something else entirely. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. This is not just a story about a queen, and it is not just a story about medieval Egypt. This is a story about power itself, about who gets to hold it, who is allowed to keep it, and what happens when the most capable person in the room is the one society never wanted anywhere near the throne. Because Shajar al Durr did not rise in a world of fairness, and she did not rise in a world that rewarded talent. She rose in a brutal political world where blood gave people status, war gave people purpose, and weakness got people erased. And the truth is, even the beginning of her life is partly hidden from us. Historians do not fully agree on her exact ethnic background, and the details of her childhood are not clearly documented, so I want to stay honest with you from the start. But what is well supported is that she began as an enslaved woman, became the favored concubine of Al-Salih Ayyub, was later freed and married by him, and slowly moved from the margins of power into its very center. That alone is extraordinary, because most people born into that position were never meant to become anything more than tools in someone else's life. But Shajar al Durr did something different. She did not simply survive inside that system. She studied it. She learned how the palace worked, how rulers made decisions, how alliances shifted, how loyalty could be bought, and how men who looked powerful from the outside could still lose everything with one wrong move. By the time Egypt entered one of the most dangerous moments in its history, she was no passive figure in the background. She was already part of the engine. Then came the Seventh Crusade, and suddenly the pressure on Egypt became enormous. Louis IX of France launched a campaign against Egypt, and in June 1249, the Crusaders captured Damietta. That was not some minor setback. That was a serious shock, because Egypt was not just another territory. Egypt was the heart of power, wealth, and survival for the Ayyubid state. And as if that was not enough, while the enemy was advancing and the state was already under pressure, Sultan al-Salih Ayyub was dying. Now stop and think about how dangerous that moment really was. Foreign invaders are moving deeper into the country. Military morale is already fragile. The ruler is gone. And if the news spreads too early, panic could destroy everything from the inside before the enemy even finishes the job. This is the moment that turned Shajar al Durr from an important court figure into a historical force. According to the major historical tradition, she kept the Sultan's death secret for a period of time while the war was still unfolding. Access to him was controlled, food continued to be taken to his tent, and orders kept moving as if the ruler was still alive. Some accounts even say she used documents the dying sultan had already signed, so commands could still be issued in his name. And whether every small detail happened exactly the same way in every retelling does not change the main point, because the main point is bigger than one detail. She understood something the people around her also understood, but may not have had the nerve to act on. If the truth came out too early, the chain of command could collapse, the army could fracture, and Egypt could fall. So she chose control over panic. And that decision may have changed everything. Because while the Crusaders had started strong, the Egyptian side did not collapse. The conflict shifted. The campaign dragged into harsher conditions, morale changed, the invaders became vulnerable, and around Al-Mansura, the momentum began to turn. Disease, confusion, exhaustion, and military pressure crushed the Crusader advance. Then came the humiliation no Crusader king wanted attached to his name. Louis IX of France was captured in 1250 and later released only after a massive ransom. That matters, because when people hear the name Shajar al Durr, they should not imagine some decorative palace woman who happened to be nearby when history unfolded. They should picture a woman standing at the center of a succession crisis during foreign invasion, helping keep the state together long enough for the invaders to be beaten back. But surviving the war was only the beginning, because once the immediate crisis passed, the question changed from how to save the state to who would control it. The obvious heir was al-Salih's son, Turan Shah, and on paper that looked like a simple transition. In reality, it was the start of another disaster. Turan Shah came in and quickly began alienating the very forces that had helped preserve the regime. He clashed with the Mamluks, angered powerful men who expected recognition and influence, and according to historical accounts, also moved against interests tied to Shajar al Durr and the late Sultan's household. That was a dangerous mistake, because he was not stepping into a stable kingdom. He was stepping into a tense battlefield full of armed men, wounded egos, fragile loyalties, and people who had already risked their lives to prevent collapse. And instead of calming that world, he provoked it. In 1250, Turan Shah was assassinated. And then, the impossible happened. Shajar al Durr was raised to the throne. Just think about how shocking that would have felt in that world. This was not quiet influence behind closed doors. This was not palace whispering. This was open rule. This was authority in public. This was the state saying, in effect, that the person on top was a woman who had once been enslaved. And for a brief moment, that reality was not symbolic. It was official. Coins were struck in her name. Her name was used in the Friday sermon according to the historical record. Even today, material evidence survives that points to the fact that her authority was not fantasy, not gossip, and not later romantic invention. It was real power. And that is exactly why her story is so fascinating. Because history sometimes lets people rise high enough to shock the world, but not high enough to escape it. She had proven that she could act under pressure. She had shown intelligence, nerve, and political skill. She had helped carry Egypt through invasion and succession chaos. But in a medieval political order, being capable was not enough. A ruler also had to be accepted. And that is where the walls started closing in around her. The wider political world did not embrace her rule easily. Syrian Ayyubid emirs refused to recognize her, and the Abbasid Caliph also pushed against the idea of Egypt being ruled this way. That pressure mattered, because power in that world did not rest on force alone. It rested on recognition, military backing, religion, political theater, and whether other elites agreed to play along. So Shajar al Durr faced the cruelest truth in politics. You can be the one who saved the state and still be treated as illegitimate by the very system you saved. And this is where her brilliance ran straight into the limits of her time. She made a political move, not a romantic one. She married the Mamluk commander Aybak, and her independent reign ended after roughly 80 days. Now some people hear that and think it means her power was over, but that would be too simple. She did not suddenly vanish. She remained central to the political transition unfolding around her, and her role in the shift from Ayyubid rule toward Mamluk rule was anything but minor. Still, the symbolism is brutal. After everything she had done, after holding things together in war, after ruling openly, after reaching a level most people in her position could never even dream of, the system still demanded that power wear a male face. That is one of the deepest tragedies in this story. She climbed to the top, but the top itself was built to reject her. And yet even then, she continued to leave marks on history. She sponsored architecture, including her mausoleum complex in Cairo. And even that feels like a statement of survival and presence, as if she was saying to the future, I was not a rumor, I was not an accident, and I was not small. But stories like this do not end peacefully, because people who rise in violent systems are almost never allowed a quiet ending. Tensions between Shajar al Durr and Aybak grew over time. He wanted greater independence. Power began shifting. Fear began spreading. Court politics, once again, turned poisonous. Then in 1257, Aybak was murdered. Some historical accounts state plainly that Shajar al Durr had him killed. Other retellings frame it through palace intrigue, personal fear, and escalating conflict. But whichever version you lean toward, the core truth is clear. Aybak died. Suspicion closed in around her, and the political balance that had protected her was gone. And once that balance vanished, everything turned against her very quickly. Her end was brutal. According to major historical accounts, she was beaten to death by slave women connected to Aybak's first wife just days after his murder. There are later retellings that add even more graphic details, but honestly, we do not need the legends to understand the darkness of that ending, because the point is not the gore. The point is the reversal. A woman who had helped hold Egypt together during invasion, who had sat on the throne, who had seen her authority stamped onto coins, who had moved history with her own decisions, died not in glory, but in violence, humiliation, and revenge. And that is what makes this story hit so hard even now. Because Shajar al Durr was not powerful in a symbolic or decorative way. She was powerful in the most threatening way possible. She was useful, intelligent, decisive, and capable of acting when others froze. She did not simply stand near power, she used it. She helped preserve a state during one of its most dangerous moments. She stood at the center of a dynastic turning point. She became part of the transition that helped open the road toward Mamluk rule, a regime that would go on to dominate Egypt for centuries. So no, her story is not just the story of a slave who became queen. That is the headline version. The real version is much sharper than that. This is the story of a woman who entered a system designed to own her, learned how that system worked better than most of the men inside it, rose high enough to save it, and then discovered that saving a system does not mean the system will ever truly accept you. So, was she a hero? Was she a survivor? Was she ruthless? Was she dangerous? Honestly, she was probably all of those things. The most unforgettable people in history are rarely clean, simple, or easy to label. They are the people who force you to sit with contradiction, the people who survive by becoming sharp enough for the world they live in, only to find that the same sharpness eventually cuts back. Shajar al Durr did not become extraordinary because life was kind to her. She became extraordinary because life gave her almost no room at all, and she forced her way into history anyway. But in worlds built on fear, force, and fragile legitimacy, brilliance can become its own kind of death sentence. And maybe that is why her story still feels so modern. Not because most of us will ever sit on a throne, and not because most of us will ever face crusaders or palace assassins, but because her story asks a question that never really dies. What happens when the most capable person in the room is the one the system was never built to accept? And there you have it. That is how a woman who began life as a slave rose high enough to rule Egypt, help shape the birth of a new political era, and leave behind one of the most intense stories in medieval history. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want more fascinating, dark, and unbelievable true stories from history, make sure you subscribe. And tell me in the comments this: Do you see Shajar al Durr as a hero who saved Egypt, or as a ruler who became just as ruthless as the brutal world around her?